Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so this will be part one of my deep dive into Scott Peterson. Okay, I did do a part zero or an introduction, basically my overall thoughts on Scott Peterson, but this is like part one of like the serious deep dive. Okay, and just so everybody knows, I used to be an attorney. Okay, and for like the last 12 or 13 years, I've been working as a consultant and legal researcher in criminal defense. Okay, so I do work professionally in criminal defense. And so in this video, I'd like to kind of give sort of an idea of sort of how I would assess this professionally if I was involved in this case. Now, in the last video, basically I put on the table that I only saw really three big issues with this case from my professional perspective. Okay. And the three issues I put out that really stood out to me, the big issues, were whether it was really appropriate to prosecute this domestic case as a death penalty case. Okay, in my opinion, that probably wasn't a good move on the prosecution's part. The second part was basically the whole issue of the significance of Scott Peterson's infidelity. Okay, the significance of it, because that's a big issue. Whether we just take it as, oh, he's just a cheater, that doesn't mean anything, or it means a lot. Okay, so basically how we would take all the evidence of Scott's infidelity and his dishonesty, and basically whether the prosecution did a good job and whether how the defense deflected on this, of how important it was, the fact of Scott being sort of unfaithful and maybe just reflecting not very good feelings toward his wife. Okay, and then the third issue is the evidence of alternative theories as to maybe whether somebody else other than Scott could have committed this crime. So those are really the big three issues. And you'll notice that I did not include an issue about the circumstantial evidence against Scott. And why did I not make that an issue? Okay, the reason I didn't make that an issue is that in a professional assessment of this case, I don't think it really is an issue. Okay, I think the circumstantial evidence against Scott is so towering, okay, that I don't even think it really deserves to be called an issue. That said, I do think the Modesto police did a terrible job of initially interviewing Scott and initially processing the circumstantial evidence against him. So I don't think Scott Peterson was actually checkmated in this case, okay? I think a lot of people don't realize the jury in the original trial came very close to hanging on this case, okay? And so we almost got a hung jury. It was just by chance and by some politics in the jury that they didn't end up with a hung jury. So we should never forget that not because Scott is innocent. Okay, it's not because Scott's innocent, but because I think the police didn't handle the evidence to really checkmate him. Okay, I think the state still had towering circumstantial evidence, but I think because the police didn't do a better job of investigating, they weren't able to checkmate him in the beginning. And what I mean by that is that the police in the very beginning weren't able to get all the juice out of the fruit of the evidence that was available in the beginning. Okay, in other words, in the very, very beginning, when they have Scott fresh and they're doing the fresh interviews of him and they've got all this fresh evidence around, it's kind of like a fruit. And the basic idea is how much juice can you get out of that fruit? How much can you milk the original fresh evidence when the evidence is very fresh, And so basically the problem I have with this is that there were lots of avenues where I think if they had done a better job of making a rapport with Scott, almost making friends with him, not showing any antagonism, not getting frustrated with him, not getting offended that he lies so much, they could have extracted more information from Scott. And why would it be important to extract more information, even if we know Scott is lying? Okay, why is it that it's good information to let a liar talk more? It's because when people lie and lie and lie, even though they're telling untruths, they're not telling the truth. A lot of information gets revealed in their lies. Okay, and so we can't forget that even when people lie their ass off, a lot of good information comes out, and you can get more contradictions that will actually put the prosecutors in a better position to checkmate the defendant. Okay. So I think in this case, you're going to see, that Al BROCCHINI basically is too emotional, and I think he got too irritated with Scott, and his emotions got the better of him, and they didn't get a better extraction of more data from Scott, including lies, because with more lies comes more contradictions, right? And if they had done a better job of just extracting more information, I think the circumstantial evidence of the logistics of how Lacey disappeared and what Scott was doing on the 24th of December, I think that could have been tied in a little bit better from the beginning, with the apparently separate issue of him being an unfaithful husband and a cheater. Okay, so right now, because he was not really checkmated, you can still have the illusion, I think, or we can still entertain the illusion that his cheating is like in a separate world, and then the logistics of how Lacey disappeared are in another world. Okay. And I think if they had done a better job of kind of gathering more information from Scott, there would be a better connection so that it wouldn't just be, oh, he cheated and that's one problem. And then, oh, there's the logistics of how Lacey disappeared and that's a separate problem. Those would have been connected better. And we could see better how his behavior around Amber Fry is actually connected to the logistics of how Lacey disappeared. And I think because the detectives did a poor job of extracting information from Scott in the beginning, I think they lost an opportunity to make a more robust connection between the logistics of how Lacey disappeared and the circumstances around Scott's affair with Amber Fry. Now, the first important thing is that the police did not know about Amber Fry until the 30th of December. Okay, so it was a few days after Christmas that they even found out about Amber Fry. And Amber Fry, because she had a friend who was involved in law enforcement. Okay, so Amber Fry had a friend in law enforcement. And so when she found out on the 30th of December from this friend, she immediately contacted the police. Okay, so Amber Fry was in contact with the police before Scott ever knew. And it's funny because the police even confronted Scott about having an affair, I think on the 3rd of January. And at that point, Scott had no idea that they had been talking to Amber Fry. So it's very important that prior to the 30th of December, okay, and like the December 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, and 29th, okay, that's like 5 days, several days that the police were just beginning to investigate this, and they really didn't know at first anything about Amber Fry. Okay, so it is true the police were operating in the blind, all right? And so they would have no way of knowing that any cheating behavior or any like infidelity or any kind of affairs that Scott was having, okay, they had no way of knowing that wouldn't just reflect his feelings about his wife, okay? And now I don't really care if somebody's cheating, okay? That's not the point. The point is if the cheating reflects like severe ambivalence or negative feelings towards your own spouse, because that goes to motive. And then the other important issue is whether the circumstances of the cheating actually ties into the logistics of how Lacey disappeared. So, it's not true. And Scott's parents are correct. Just because you're cheating, that doesn't mean you have a motive to kill. Okay. So the cheating would have to reveal some really spectacular, special information about Scott's attitudes towards Lacey, or some actual connection to the actual logistics of how she ended up disappearing on the 24th of December. And so the police had no way of knowing in the beginning, number one, whether Scott was cheating, but even if they had discovered it, they wouldn't necessarily know until digging a little deeper that the relationship with Amber would reveal some logistical issues that would directly tie into Scott's purchasing of the small boat. So to us, this is all obvious, okay, because we all have all this information looking back, okay, and it's very obvious that there's a major connection between Amber Fry and the timeline of Scott getting his boat, okay, so we can see that now. All right, but back when this case was first being investigated in the first 5 or 6 days, the police had no idea of whether Scott was even cheating. They may have suspected something, but they didn't actually know whether Scott was cheating. And they certainly had no idea who he was cheating with. So they would have no idea that there was like a logistical connection between the actual cheating and the actual mechanics of how Lacey may have disappeared. Okay, so we have to kind of put ourselves back in the shoes of the police, and so they're just gathering information as they're just beginning to investigate Lacey's disappearance. So what really got the ball rolling on this investigation with regard to Scott Peterson himself? Okay, this would be on the evening of December 24th. This is Christmas Eve, I think, going past midnight and into early hours of Christmas Day. This would be Al Brocchini's interview. Okay, this is Detective Al Brocchini interviewing Scott Peterson. And I think this is where we're going to start to see where I think the problems began, I think, for the prosecution. And if anything, this should remind us of maybe how not to conduct an interview. Okay. Now, it wasn't that it was a terrible, terrible interview, but looking back, there are, I think, some very important things that Al Brocchini could have done differently in the way he conducted this interview. Now, in my experience, when interviewing witnesses or when taking depositions, okay, you have sort of two heads going on. You're sort of thinking in two tracks. Okay, on the one hand, you're trying to keep like a big picture in your head, And then on the other hand, you're sort of reacting to the interviewee. Okay. And I think that with experience, you learn not to react so much to the interviewee and just to stick to the big picture. Okay. And I think what was happening with Brocchini was that he sort of had his eye on the big picture, but he was also kind of reacting a lot to Scott. And I think that was a big mistake. Okay. I think the best attitude, regardless of how a person's acting, yeah, you notice how they're behaving, you notice their demeanor. And Scott did have a very problematic demeanor during his interview with Al Brocchini, for sure. But Al Brocchini should have noticed those things without taking his eye off the big picture. Okay. And so Al Brocchini, as he was kind of reacting, he sort of lost track of just doing the full checklist of just getting all the information and just sticking to getting all the information to develop a timeline for exactly what happened in Scott's life and what happened in Lacey's life, in the hours, let's say before Scott says he went fishing, and then, in the afternoon. So basically, if I was doing this interview, I would have just stuck just to the nuts and bolts of just, what happened. And then if Scott did anything like had a funny attitude, I'd say, well, let's keep going, Scott. I know, let's get back to the timeline and let's just keep going step by step by step. So let's take a deep dive into this. And I'm going to show some key points where I think the detective is not sticking to just the nuts and bolts timeline. And very important, when you're doing an interview in criminal case, you always want to note every time there's a mention or a suggestion of something that would be very unlikely or very low probability. Okay, because as you're assessing, let's say the defendant's version of what's happening in a criminal case, you can have a few very unlikely, unusual things like on the same day. But when you start to have like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 very unusual, very unlikely events, that is a red flag. Okay. And I think Al Brocchini shouldn't react to that, but he should note it. And he should note if there's like, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 very unusual or unlikely or super coincidental events taking place, and just kind of make a note of very many unlikely, low probability events. Okay. So let's take a deep dive into Al Brocchini right now.
Lacey got up and went and assumed she had some cereal for breakfast. She eats right when she wakes up, otherwise she gets sick because she's pregnant. I laid around in bed longer. I got up at 8 o'clock probably or so. Showered. We were watching her favorite show, Martha Stewart. Watched a little bit of that.
You didn't watch the whole thing, though?
No.
Remember what part you saw? I mean, I don't know what.
Yeah. Some cookie meal. I don't know. Okay. Cookies of some sort. They're talking about what to do with meringue.
Okay, did you eat any breakfast?
Yeah, cereal.
Okay, so here Al Brocchini is doing a pretty good job, okay? Because first he's allowing Scott just to open-endedly just talk about what happened that morning. So Scott is just offering all kinds of information, maybe some true, maybe some false, but he's offering a lot of material information about exactly what was happening at what time, okay? And all these details could eventually have importance. For example, Scott says at the very end of this introduction that he actually ate a bowl of cereal, okay? That's an important piece of data, because later on it's going to look like he ate nothing the whole day. Okay. And so you just kind of want to pay attention to those things, because, that'll start to set up what I would consider to be an unusual or low probability event, like not eating all day. Okay. The fact that he had a little bowl of cereal, well, that could be good or that could be bad, because if he had, like, say, like a pile of eggs and ham and a bunch of pancakes, and then looking at Scott and noticing he's a little bit overweight. Okay, this is the detail, right? He's a little bit overweight. So would a bowl of cereal be enough for this guy to go the whole day? If he ate, like, say, beans and a 5-egg omelet and a bunch of sausages and bacon, well, then I could understand him skipping lunch. Okay, but if all he had was a bowl of cereal, and then later he's going to claim that he had no lunch at all, I'm going to put that down as a low probability event, okay, an unlikely low probability event, and you start adding those things up, okay? And then the second thing is the Martha Stewart, all right? And this is where we may see the first mistake of Al Brocchini, because Al Brocchini, what he does is he tries to get Scott to make more precise, what exactly did you see in the Martha Stewart, right? But what he did not do, he did not put a little footnote to say, okay, and then after you saw this part about the meringue, Do you think you were in the house for, like, say, another 5 minutes, another 8 minutes, another 12 minutes, another 20 minutes? Give me kind of an idea, Scott, after you heard the meringue, about how much longer do you think you were in the house? And tell me what you did after you stopped paying attention to Martha Stewart. What did you put on your jacket? Maybe go in the backyard. Tell me a little more, about the transition between the meringue and then when you stopped paying attention to Martha Stewart and then when you exited the house to get in the truck. And this is where I think we're starting to see that Al Brocchini, I can just tell as you look more in the interview, he doesn't really have the personality of an engineer or a mechanic. He has more the personality of an irritated cop. He's just kind of annoyed with Scott. And as the interview goes on, you're going to see that he really doesn't believe Scott. And I think he's kind of offended by Scott. Okay. And I can understand that because it's obvious Scott does not appear very upset. Okay. The main emotion you would see in an innocent husband is, who the hell has my wife? And what the hell is she experiencing? The uncertainty of, God, what kind of terrible people is she with right now? And that uncertainty would eat you up. He doesn't have any uncertainty. And so any honest cop's going to be really irritated with Scott. Okay. But you have to put that aside and you have to put on the cap of a mechanic. Okay. You're just gathering information, and the information will checkmate him later, but you have to put on your thinking hat and not get emotional and just say, okay, Scott, I'm just collecting information. You're my collaborator. I'm getting along with you, develop the rapport. Okay. And let's just collect information together, and with no suggestion that they're actually suspicious of him. And then you could get more information, and Scott could have given him an abundance of information that later would hang himself. Because then he could checkmate himself by saying, yeah, I think I was in the house for like 8 or 10 more minutes after seeing the meringue. Okay, that would hang him. Okay. Or he could say, maybe he wouldn't say, well, I don't remember how many minutes, but I know that after I saw the meringue, I think I was watching the show for about 3 more minutes, or maybe 4 more minutes. And then I think I put my jacket on. I think I went to the backyard for a second. And then you can start to infer, a certain amount of time. Okay. And we'll see later how that could be so important. Okay, so Brocchini just continues, just collecting just basic, just kind of nuts and bolts timeline data. Okay, and basically he runs into the first issue where I think he starts getting upset. I think Brocchini starts getting upset, and I can understand because I would also get upset. And this is the first part where I think Scott is clearly not being honest. Okay, and if I were a cop or an attorney or somebody interviewing him here, I would also be very concerned about Scott, and I would immediately start thinking he's being very deceptive. So let's listen to this part here.
She told you what she was gonna do for the day?
Yeah.
And what was that?
She's gonna finish cleaning up. Like I said, she's mopping the kitchen floor. Take the dog for a walk, and then she's going to the store to buy for Christmas morning breakfast tomorrow. And that was gonna be involved prep. So that was her, just prepping the breakfast, and she's gonna make gingerbread cookies for tonight.
Okay, so something you get used to when you interview people is something that I call rambling non-responsiveness. Rambling non-responsiveness. Okay, he was asked a question, what did Lacey say she was going to do? You said that Lacey told you what she was going to do, okay? And instead of him saying, yes, Lacey told me, he kind of gets into this mumbling kind of weird thing. And, I don't care if he's acting calm. The fact that he's acting calm, that doesn't mean anything to me. But the fact that he's kind of not being responsive, he's sort of like, she was mopping the floor. And it's like, that's not being responsive. I would have said, Scott, my question is, what did she say she was going to do? Okay. And already he would know that I'm getting irritated. So you have to keep your poker face, and you also have to be diplomatic. So I would probably say, okay. So you saw her mopping, but I guess I'm kind of curious to know if she said anything to you, because that could help us, kind of be more friendly about it. But clearly in the back of the mind, he's just rattling off all this information about what he already knew Lacey was supposed to do, but he's not really saying what came out of her mouth and describing her talking about what she was going to do. Okay. And so I would consider this to be very weird, bizarre, kind of rambling non-responsiveness. And to be quite honest, my instincts, my intuition would tell me this guy's full of shit. Okay. And I would feel that, but keep my poker face, keep my diplomacy, and act like a collaborator and say, okay, very good. Thank you, Scott. That's pretty good information. Now, I'm also kind of interested just to know what she may have said, okay, because that's also valuable to us, just in case that would just give us any information that could help us maybe try to locate her now. and then just say, if you can just try to struggle, Scott, to just try to remember anything she may have said to you and tell me sort of how she said it. Don't summarize it, but just sort of tell me what she said and how she said it. And that would kind of help in this situation. But I can understand, I would also be irritated. So I'd have to really put my poker face and I have to really kind of discipline myself not to get irritated. And I think we'll notice later on in this interview, when Al Brocchini circles back to the mopping, you can tell in his tone of voice that he's very upset about Scott because he just knows he's lying, or at least he has the instinct. And, I can understand that, but this is the place I think where Al Brocchini started getting upset. You don't really see it in this clip, but I can tell because Scott is clearly being dishonest. But because Al Brocchini, I think, started getting irritated at this point, okay, I think he really missed a huge catch, okay, because where Scott is being kind of dishonest around the mopping, and you could tell the mopping is part of a non-responsive, kind of dishonest, deceptive, sort of very weaselly kind of answer. I think Al Brocchini missed an important detail. If he was really playing chess here, he'd notice that it was right in this explanation of what, instead of saying what she said she was going to do, where he's kind of telling his version of, it's Scott's narrative, not what Lacey said, it's Scott's narrative. Right after he says mopping the floor, he says, take the dog for a walk. He didn't say Lacey said, I'm going to take the dog for a walk. He said, take the dog for a walk. And that's important because this is Scott's narrative. Okay. So if I was putting my little notes here, I would say, note to myself, okay, Scott is telling his version of what we want, of what he wants us to know, or what he wants us to think. Okay. So this is Scott's version. And Scott, as he's being deceptive around the mopping, or he appears deceptive or weaselly around the mopping, right afterward, he mentions not that Lacey said, but that she's going to take the dog for a walk. So I would put that as a note. This may be what Scott wants us to think. Okay. This may be Scott's invention or Scott's version of things, not necessarily Lacey's version of things. So basically, I would have this down as a potential for Scott setting up like an alibi, or like setting up like a diversion or a distraction from what really happened. Okay, so that later on, if we see any evidence that maybe the dog is out without a leash, or the dog's out with a leash or something, we might suppose that there is reason in the way he's answering questions that maybe he's the one that let the dog out with the leash on or whatever. So just to have it there. And you see, just from analyzing the way he talks, you would already have that as a possibility, because right where he has a dishonesty around the mopping, because he's not really being responsive. He's not talking about what Lacey said. He's talking about sort of his narrative around Lacey. Right there, he puts in take the dog for a walk. And he really didn't say, Lacey said, I am going to take the dog for a walk. He said Lacey was going to take the dog for a walk. That, you can't prove it, but I would have it down as potentially this is Scott's version. And possibly Scott has an interest in creating this version of things, So we're already losing track from, what did Lacey say she was going to do? And obviously Scott's going to lie about that too. But just the fact that he's being weaselly, I would say I'm not going to ignore the fact that that's very close to where he mentions the dog being taken for a walk, and not really saying it came out of Lacey's mouth, or really not underlining it, that this is how Lacey said it, And if the cops had done a better job of interviewing with a better poker face, being friendly with Scott, and really asking for him just to kind of tell us how Lacey said things, Scott would still have lied, okay, but you would have more information and more contradictions, and maybe Scott would have he might have stepped in it a few times, by just giving kind of more bullshit answers. And the more bullshit answers you give, the more contradictions eventually will come to the surface. So I can understand Al Brocchini being upset here. I would probably be a little annoyed here too, because it's almost like Scott really is not a collaborator, okay, and that's inherently frustrating to anybody who's trying to interview somebody. This guy's not really collaborating, okay. He's going to be weaselly. It's going to be a pain in the ass. So I would be also upset. But Scott's now about to talk about the supposed fishing trip. Okay. And Al Brocchini really needs to calm himself down and sort of get his discipline so he can keep a clear head, because Scott's going to spew another load of BS here. But let's just listen to what he says. Now, let's just go piece by piece for how Scott describes his decision to go fishing.
When did you realize you were going to go fishing?
Oh, that was a morning decision. It's either go play golf at the club or go fishing.
Okay.
It seemed too cold to go play golf at the club, so.
Okay, so if you have any experience interviewing people, you can see he's changing his grammar here. Okay, normally he talks pretty directly, but here he goes way into passive voice. It was a morning decision, like it was out of his own personhood. Like instead of saying, I made a decision, it's like it happened. It was like this morning decision that just happened. Kind of that's a little bit of dissociation, a little bit of distancing. Okay, obviously that's something psychological that's going on with him. And then secondly, the way inappropriate laughter, where Scott gets into this kind of thing where he's trying to make some kind of rapport with Al Brocchini, like ha ha ha, like it was a little too cold to be playing golf, so inappropriate. Okay, very inappropriate expression of glib emotion. Sort of ha ha ha, laughing about. Right now, what should be 85% in his brain is where the hell is my wife? If he was actually uncertain about his wife. So I would put down in my notes that I am concerned that Scott is not actually uncertain about Lacey's whereabouts. Okay, so even if she's dead, at least you don't have to worry about her being with some slimy, dirty criminals, in some crazy place. So even though she's dead, at least you have the peace of mind of knowing you don't have to worry about her being tortured or being like in terrible fear. So I would have in my notes like Scott does not appear to be concerned or to have any uncertainty. I wouldn't say anything in the interview. I would just keep it to myself, but I would note it. And I would say, this inappropriate expression of emotion right around where he's trying to create this explanation of how there was a morning decision made, like out of the body, like he didn't make the decision, I made the decision, right? So he's getting into this passive voice, and he's getting right there as he's getting into this explanation, he's expressing inappropriate emotions. So I would say these are all weird flags. This is all kind of unusual sort of emotive behavior. I would say this is suspicious. And then secondly, I would say, okay, Scott, so a decision was made in the morning, okay, but you said that on the one hand, you say you made a decision in the morning, but also you're saying that as of the morning, you had these two options, okay, which was go fishing or play golf. So when did you put these two options on the table? Was this something you had planned a couple of days in advance? Like in a couple of days in advance, did you have this menu of A and B, go fishing or play golf? So I know you made the final decision in the morning, but when did you first even consider having this option of going fishing as an option to playing golf? Because that's where you're going to start to get into maybe when he got the fishing license. And any good cop is gonna, or any good attorney investigator is gonna have it as a note, like, I'm gonna follow up on this. Did he get a fishing license? Where did he get the fishing license? That'll come later. You don't want to make it sound like an interrogation, right? If you make it sound too much like an interrogation, you're going to make him scared, and then he's not going to want to talk, right? So you want to keep this friendly. But I would have it, hey, I'm going to circle back to this. And of course, later on, if I can, I'm going to ask about the fishing license. But clearly, he's also contradicting himself, because he says it was a morning decision. But really, that's not really the full truth, because really what it looks like is that if we even go by Scott's version, in the morning, he already had an A and a B, a plan A and a plan B, And so when did he come up with that menu option of A and B? That would be like the golf or the fishing. Obviously, he's going to have to admit it was maybe the night before or it's a couple of days before. And then at that point, if he says it was just like the night before, then that'll be a contradiction when we later see his fishing license. And the other interpretation on this A versus B, okay, is that maybe, and any detective would put this down for his own personal notes. Okay, you're not going to tell Scott this, but down in his personal notes, Al Brocchini is going to say, okay, he has an A and a B story. He has an A and a B plan. Maybe he has an A and a B story. That may mean maybe Scott had an idea of what he wanted other people to think, and then in versus what he really wanted to do. So the A and the B, the golf versus the fishing, this may also have been, and you put it down in your notes, this may be where let's look for other evidence where maybe Scott was telling people he was going golf, when really he was maybe keeping it a secret. Also very important, it's also possible that Scott always reserved the option not to kill Lacey. Maybe he was privately hesitating, and he thought to himself, okay, if I don't kill her, then I'm going to go play golf, and maybe that was sort of his alternate that he kept for himself, that maybe I won't kill her, or maybe I won't have the opportunity to kill her. And so maybe he kept that option just so that he would be consistent with everybody that he may in fact go play golf if he either chooses not to kill Lacey, or if maybe he just decides not to kill her, or circumstances prevent him from killing Lacey. So, that could be the other explanation for the A and the B, that he was reserving options for himself. And then have a second note. If he wants to conceal the fishing, but he wants everybody to know about the golf, then later on, when you find out about this boat being a new boat, that's a brand new boat, you're going to have the natural question whether he told people about the boat. You see, so you see how all these things come out of just these basic facts. These basic fresh facts. So Scott basically, he admits he had two plans. He had an A and a B. Okay, so my concern is, well, maybe that means you had something you wanted people to know about, and then privately you had this plan B. Okay, and then secondly, when we get into the boat, since the fishing is already starting to look like maybe a possibly a story that he wanted to keep to himself, then I'm going to naturally want to know how many people knew about the boat. And then you get into the idea whether he was maybe concealing the fact of the boat. So all these things originate just from the way he's talking, and they're just natural questions that any investigator would have on their mind. Okay, and so this is where I kind of criticize Brocchini, because he should have been more methodical and maybe had more of a mechanics attitude about processing these issues. Okay, so already as far as like unusual things and maybe just kind of anomalous things about this interview, and maybe things that seem a little unlikely or improbable, okay, I'm already seeing a couple of like 2 or 3 red flags. Okay, the first red flag is that when he was specifically asked about what did Lacey say she was going to do, he gives this mumbling, weaselly, kind of non-responsive thing where he just says he gives his version without getting into her mouth of what she said. Okay, so that's already kind of a grammatical, kind of a weasel step. So that happened right at the time where he's trying to offer his own explanation of the mopping and the dog walking. Okay, so right there, the mopping and the dog walking to me are things where Scott is showing signs of, I think, clear deception, or at least something anomalous in the way he's explaining, some variation from the baseline. All right. And then the second thing is when he's asked to explain his decision to go fishing. Okay, he says it's a morning decision, but he says it in a passive voice. Okay, and he's also at the same time admitting that he really made the decision earlier to have those two A and B on the table, the plan A and the plan B. Okay, and he's just kind of summarizing it was all decided on the morning, when really the A and the B was probably hatched either a day or two earlier. And so right there, the passive voice and the inappropriate emotion, I would say I'm detecting anomalous, potentially suspicious, or maybe he's not telling the truth about how he made the decision to go fishing and how that connects to the story about playing golf. Okay, and naturally then, as he gets into talking about the boat, I'm going to want to know if he was potentially concealing or just not telegraphing to many people the fact that he even had the boat. Okay, so right there, just from this very early stage, I'm already seeing a lot of issues and a lot of concerns. So when we get to the boat, okay, obviously we're gonna want to pay attention to that. But let's go back to Scott's story. Okay, so now Scott's going to talk about going fishing. All right. And like I said, he's a kind of an overweight guy. He looks a little pudgy. He himself calls himself pudgy. Okay. And all he had was cereal for breakfast. Right. Now I understand, some people, they eat cereal for breakfast, but he's a little overweight and he looks like he probably has a pretty good appetite. So I'm going to be concerned, about maybe what he did as far as eating during the day, because if he's not eating during the day, that tells me he's really preoccupied, and it's not just the leisure activity that he pretends this fishing trip is going to be. So let's listen to what he says.
Okay, did you drive straight there?
I did.
You stop for lunch?
No.
You buy bait?
No, I'm a bait fisherman.
You didn't buy no lunch? You didn't eat nothing? You didn't take a lunch?
No, I didn't.
So now I'm starting to see too many coincidences. Okay, too many improbable, sort of unlikely things happening all in the same day. And also we'll notice that Scott is not just calm. I don't think calm is the word to describe him. He just seems kind of really just not very generous with his expressions. Like he really just isn't opening up. He seems, I wouldn't say calm, I would say more inert. Or it's almost like he's in his own like private comfort zone, like his own like cocoon comfort zone. And it's this bizarre, almost like dissociated comfort zone, because the circumstances here have nothing to do with comfort and there's nothing to be comfortable about. So this guy is sort of cocooning himself into almost this trance. It's like this very comfortable trance. And I would already be saying this guy has some emotional issues. All right. Now I wouldn't necessarily challenge him about it, but I'm thinking this guy's got some emotional issues. Okay. We've already see how something seems fishy about the mopping and the dog getting let out, the way he explained how that happened. Um, and then now, as he's talking about driving to go fishing, he's making it very clear that he ate nothing all day. He had no food all day. Okay. And I know for some people, they can just go many, many hours without eating, but this guy's kind of overweight. And I would chalk this down to something else that is unusual. Okay. And so this is starting to add up now. And here, I think Al Brocchini has to really discipline himself not to get reactive and just cool down, stay like the cool mechanic, and just keep collecting information. Okay. And we'll see how well he does that, because now we're going to get into some real information about the actual fishing trip.
So if you got to about 5 minutes to 1, you get your boat in, how long do you think you stayed in the water?
Felt like an hour and a half or so.
Did you have a map for that area, or?
No.
Would you just wing it? So you just, when you got in your boat and you took off, did you go very far, or?
Well, I mean, probably a couple miles. I went north, found like a little island kind of deal there. Island had a bunch of trash on it. I remember a big sign that said no landing. It looked like some broken piers around it. I just assumed it would be a decent, shallow area.
Did you troll?
A little bit. I mean, a lot of the reason I went was just to get that boat in the water.
Okay, so here again, we're seeing inconsistencies and anomalies in the way he's talking, okay? Because he wants to open all up about, certain aspects, he's just kind of boating around, close to the Berkeley Marina, kind of near that island that's close to the Berkeley Marina. And he kind of goes into some detail about that, not too much, but then he talks almost nothing about fishing. Okay, that's just a little inconsistent. If it really was a fishing trip, then what fishing does he have to talk about? And then when he's asked about trolling, he's like, "Yep, a little bit not generous. Something is not right." And of course, Al Brocchini, he can just say, "Okay, cool. So tell me a little bit. What does trolling look like? Tell me about your trolling. I want to have a good picture of what was happening here. That's part of our job as policemen. We do need to collect, pretty extensive information here. So tell me a little bit about the trolling. You said you're not a bait fisherman. Tell me all about the trolling. Tell me, how many lures did you use? Where did you go? Just tell me what it looks like." And Al Brocchini is just he's also kind of not really staying on the ball as far as the timeline. I think in a way it's because Al Brocchini already has decided he doesn't really believe Scott. So he's kind of losing interest in Scott's story. But I think I would invest myself in Scott's story, and I would say, please tell me, what does trolling look like? I need to hear that. Let's go into the detail, kind of getting back to the detail. And so then Scott kind of understands that he's not being very generous, because he probably knows he doesn't have a lot of details about fishing. And so he says, well, a lot of the reason why I did was just to get the boat in the water. A lot of the reason I went there was just to get the boat in the water. So he's already kind of backtracking on the fishing. And that right there is another weaseling answer that tells me that around this trolling story, there's probably some deception, or he doesn't really want to give the full truth about what's really happening. Okay. So this is again, we got some issues with the way he's telling his story, and here I think there are a lot of opportunities for Al Brocchini to sort of give better follow-up questions, to sort of force him at least to make some shit up. And the more shit he makes up, the more lies he tells, the more we're going to have more contradictions to use against him later. So again, Al Brocchini right here, I think he's already kind of decided he doesn't believe Scott, and so basically what we have here is just a lot of missed opportunities to follow up and get more specific responses. Also, just for my notes, if I'm Al Brocchini right now, I'm going to put a note to myself. If Scott really wasn't that interested in fishing, if it was just to test the boat on the water, okay, then I'm going to want to know why he would purchase a fishing license. Okay, if his real goal is just to test the boat out, why would he waste his money on the fishing license? Or the next question would be, why didn't he buy a fishing license for a whole year if he really is so interested in the boat? I mean, all kinds of questions, but this information here where he really maybe wasn't interested in fishing, that's going to tie into the fishing license, or at least potential questions around the fishing license. Okay, so now we get to another part of the interview, okay, where I think now we have too many coincidences, okay? And if I was Al Brocchini, I would be really upset at this point, but again, you have to have that discipline. Okay, he has to really keep his cool. Okay, but now Scott's going to talk about something that's way unusual. That's just now we just have too many unlikely, too many low probability events. And so on top of his weird kind of dishonesty around, the letting the dog out, Lacey mopping, just unsatisfactory responses. And then the passive voice about the decision between A and B, the golfing versus the boating, just kind of vague about that, and just kind of weird passive voice around that. And then just kind of very ungenerous talk about, what he actually did on the water, just no generosity talking about the trolling, no description of the trolling he supposedly did. And on top of that, mysteriously the guy's not eating anything all day. And on top of that, okay, now we just get too many unusual things. Okay, now we have all these market umbrellas that he intended to take to his office, but he accidentally drove them all the way to Berkeley. That's just weird. It's just weird. And it's just another low probability, another anomalous, weird thing going on. And let's just see how Scott talks about, and let's see how generous Scott is as he talks about these market umbrellas.
Those umbrellas, were they in your car before, too?
Put them in this morning. Intent was to leave them at the warehouse.
And so you took them to Berkeley with you?
Yeah. Got to take them out.
So you put the umbrellas in there this morning, though, because you were gonna store them at the warehouse?
Yeah.
Did you just forget?
I mean, I even saw them in there when I locked the door, but it's lazy.
Okay, so Al Brocchini says, did you just forget? And Scott's like, like real, almost insolent, And that reminds me of a little clip when he's being interviewed by Diane Sawyer, where Diane Sawyer says, do you really expect people to believe that your wife is just saintly and just casual about, you admitting that you're having an affair? And he's like, well, you don't know. And then he goes, oh, nobody knows. Like he tries to clean up his answer. And so when Al Brocchini says, what, did you just forget? And he's like, uh-huh. So it's like he has these little leakages where he's kind of insolent and kind of disrespectful. And then he corrects himself and tries to explain, tries to give a better explanation. But you can tell deep down inside emotionally, he's not collaborating with Brocchini and he's not being generous about these, about these market umbrellas. And in light of all the other highly unlikely, unusual things that are happening on this day, he's got another very unusual thing happening with these market umbrellas. And I think he knows he's not giving a very charitable, very generous explanation. And frankly, we're just starting to see too many unusual things adding up on the same day for the same person. The other thing that concerns me here is that when Scott tries to give some explanation, because he first has that kind of insolent thing where he just tells Al Brocchini, whatever, I guess I just forgot, whatever. And then he realizes that he was being a little insolent. He tries to explain that, well, yeah, I noticed it as I was driving away, but I was just lazy. And he just leaves it with this one word explanation. But then later when he's talking about, or I think it was earlier or later, when he's talking about the things he did at his office, okay, before he took the boat to Berkeley Marina, he says that he actually assembled a woodworking tool and he also did some emailing with, I think, his bosses in Europe. Okay. And this is really interesting because now we can see that when Scott is addressing something that's dangerous, okay, like a dangerous fact, like what are you doing with a brand new boat? Okay, what are you doing with a brand new boat on the same day that your wife goes missing? That's obviously a dangerous subject matter, right? Because that could easily explain why Lacey is missing, right? But then when there are other facts that sort of don't have anything to do with possibly a missing person, like say, having a brand new boat that nobody knows about, okay, that's a dangerous fact in the context of a missing wife, right? But assembling a woodworking tool and sending emails to your bosses in Europe, that's a very safe fact because that would tend to make you look innocent, right? What's a murderer doing assembling a woodworking tool and sending emails? I mean, except the alternative is that he's setting up kind of an alibi, or he's setting up a story that's inconsistent with him being a killer, right? But then, so it's interesting that when we're dealing with facts that would tend to make him look innocent, he goes into tremendous detail and he offers abundant information, okay? And he's very chatty about it, right? But then when you're dealing with facts that could make him look guilty, okay, mysteriously, he has these one-word answers and he doesn't explain anything. Okay, so let's see the contrast when he's talking about this mortiser woodworking tool that he got and supposedly assembled on the very same day. So let's listen to that.
What did you do over there?
I assembled my mortiser. You know what a mortiser is?
No.
It's a woodworking tool to make tables. Maybe you saw it on the trailer there.
Okay.
About yay big.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just got that, so I assembled it.
So I realize the differences are subtle because, you know, Scott is kind of a subtle guy. He's obviously kind of a smart guy. I mean, he looks pretty sharp. You know, he's definitely no dummy. I mean, we don't need to underestimate Scott. He's not lacking in intelligence, and he's certainly a very resourceful person. But anyway, so the differences are very subtle. The differences are subtle, but it is true that, you know, when he's talking about a fact that couldn't possibly make him look like a murderer, okay, like assembling his tool, you know, and it's a perfect situation to make him look like he's not killing somebody or he's not hiding a body, you know, because it's totally inconsistent with being a guilty murderer to be assembling your woodworking tool. So it's something that tends to make him look very innocent. And he actually asked questions to Brocchini. Do you even understand what I'm saying? Do you know what this is? And just adding all this extra explanation. But why didn't Scott offer that explanation about the trolling? You know, hey, Al Brocchini, when I say trolling, do you know what I mean? Here, let me tell you what I did. You know, so like, no, not at all. Or like, oh, let me explain a little more about the market umbrellas. Although, to be quite honest, the market umbrellas, it sounds like there's really nothing. I couldn't imagine any explanation that would make that look innocent. You know what I mean? So he really doesn't have anything to say because I don't think even a very creative person wouldn't really be able to come up with a reasonable explanation for carrying those market umbrellas. Also, everything about Scott makes him look like a very multitasking, very kind of very resourceful, very detail oriented person. I mean, and even if you assume the worst, you know, if you assume that he actually you know, killed his wife, I mean, he's doing all this phenomenal multitasking all while not even eating, you know, in a very short period of time. So he's obviously a very resourceful, very effective multitasking kind of guy. And so then for him to propose that he was lazy, you know, as he's driving away and he sees the market umbrellas, I think a more likely explanation, and of course I would just put this in my notes, I would say lazy, or maybe he's now in a hurry. You know what I mean? Like he's already wasted time setting up things that make himself look innocent. Like he's already probably taken a huge risk having a body in the back of this truck, okay? Or maybe having transferred the body to the boat. I'm not sure how he did it, but you know, having a human body who happens to be his wife, you know, in his office, and he's already doing all this nervous stuff where he's setting up this woodworking tool to sort of build his quote unquote alibi, you know, to make himself look innocent, sending emails to make himself look like he's not doing anything with a body. And by now he must be pretty nervous. And when he finally gets in the truck and it's time to leave, I'm not sure lazy is what's happening to him. I think it may be he now feels like he's in a hurry. You know, I would never tell him that, but I would have that in my notes because later on, as I start to checkmate him later, hopefully in follow-up interviews, then I could circle back to these little things. You know, oh, Scott, you said you were lazy. Is that really, I mean, the way you describe yourself, you don't really sound like a lazy guy. So, you know, help me understand a little better. Was it maybe more you were in a hurry, you know, something like that? And you'd be surprised because questions like that can actually elicit very useful responses, even from non-cooperative witnesses. Okay, so let's say if I tried now, if you sound too challenging, if you're like trying to pin him down and it sounds like an interrogation, of course he's going to get defensive and he's going to want an attorney. But if you say it in a conversational way, like, well, maybe would it be more accurate, Scott? Because you don't really sound like a lazy guy. You're sort of flattering him, right? You don't really sound like a lazy guy. Could it, if you really think about it, if you think more carefully about what really happened, do you think it's more that maybe you were sort of in a hurry? You know, is that more like it? And see, he's likely to actually admit that and say yes. Oh, yes, actually, you know, I think I was. It was more that I was in a hurry. Sorry, yeah, I was kind of in a hurry because. And then he's going to say something that's going to put him not directly in trouble, but later on it could get him into trouble. For example, he might say, yeah, because. Yeah, I was kind of in a hurry because I knew that after the Berkeley Marina, I had to get back to Vela Farms for the gift basket for Papa or something like that. So he would sort of put his foot into it, right? And then later on, you could use that against him because maybe if there's any sign that maybe he took too much time at the Berkeley Marina, or maybe if he makes some claim, I think later he said it was getting too cold on the San Francisco Bay, so I cut it short. Okay, well, see there. that might actually, because he's trying to make it sound like he didn't just want to go put the boat in the water and come right back, right? Because then that would make it look like you had no purpose for taking the boat out. So it's that would be more in favor of him dumping a body, right? Oh, I just got in the boat and and then I just turned around. It's like, what? That doesn't sound right, you know. So he has to say something like, oh, I think at some point he says it was getting very cold on the bay, and so I cut it short, you know. And then you can say, well, Scott, but you just told me an hour ago that you were in a hurry to get to Vela Farm. So which is it, Scott? You know, was it that it was getting too cold on the bay, or was it because you were in a hurry to get back to Vela Farm? See, now we're starting to get in some contradiction. But you want to save those contradictions for maybe 2 or 3 interviews in the future, because in the meantime, you just want to get a bunch of contradictory information. And what you're going to see now is that Al Brocchini starts to show that he's really not happy with Scott. And instead of opening up the interview so that he can set up, like, say, some future interviews, okay, like he could have said this: hey, Scott, you want to know what? First of all, I want to thank you for coming in. Okay, Scott, I really appreciate you coming in. I really appreciate your cooperation. And what I'm hoping is that I can count on, I hope, your continued assistance to us. So, you know, I don't know, Scott, would you be happy to come in tomorrow and we can maybe do a follow up? Because there are just some few other things that we'd like to talk about, you know. But maybe tonight you can get some rest. And again, we just really appreciate your assistance. You know, that way, kind of grease him up, kind of flatter him, so that maybe the next day, and then maybe the day after that, he might give more information. And then you just save all the gotchas and all the confrontation, maybe for much later in the future. You see. Anyway, so unfortunately, let's see where Al Brocchini starts to maybe lose his patience, and he starts to actually start confronting Scott. And I think it's a big mistake. He could have saved the confrontation for maybe 2 or 3 interviews later, because there's actually more information that Al Brocchini needs to get out of Scott. Okay, and I think it's a little premature to start actually confronting him. But let's see what ends up happening. To me, this is where the interrogation breaks down. Okay, but let's just take a look at what happens.
Curious, Maggie was there on, or Maggie and Marguerite, but she was there on Monday, and obviously she did a lot of work, the towels were filthy. Why was your wife mopping on Tuesday morning?
I don't know. Got me. She was pretty fastidious about it, though.
Was she?
With the dog and the cats, and her, doing the Christmas deal. That was pretty common.
Was that going to be at your house?
Tomorrow, or today, rather.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah, she always had the vacuum and mop out.
Okay, so that isn't unusual.
No.
Okay, so to me, this is the part of the interview where the state lost its opportunity to checkmate Scott. Okay, they really screwed up. This is really a screw up, okay? Because this is the first time in the interview that Al Brocchini clearly shows that he's actually now interrogating Scott, and that this is not just a conversation. Okay, before he's been sort of acting, you know, kind of at least acting, you know, trying to act like it's just a conversation. But now it's very clear this is an interrogation, and that's a mistake. That's a mistake, because I know that Al Brocchini is probably been upset at Scott this whole interview. Okay, I would actually be annoyed, because Scott has actually proven he's not a cooperative witness. Okay, and in little subtle ways, he's very arrogant. He's very cagey. He's very wily. He's very slimy with his answers, and he's clearly not a cooperative witness. So I can understand why Al Brocchini's upset, but he should never have shown Scott how he felt. Okay, and he should never have let Scott know that this was actually an interrogation. It's too early. And why do I say that? And why do I say that this is why the state almost lost this case? Because let's not forget, this case actually almost hung. The jury almost hung in this case. Okay, even on guilt, on the guilt phase. Okay, one juror was not going to vote guilty. Okay, and only through politics that juror got kicked off the jury. So, and I think it's because of this point in the interview. Okay, because if Al Brocchini had just stayed calm, there was way more important questions to ask about the new boat. Okay, I kept saying Scott had a brand new boat. What I mean is he had a recently new boat. He just recently purchased a boat. Okay, and Scott admitted in this interview that his boat was recently purchased. He admitted it, because he said, I wanted to get my boat in the water. Okay, that he was, you know, the context is clearly that this boat is recently purchased, right? And so that sets up huge questions that Al Brocchini hasn't gotten the information yet, right? Huge questions about the timeline of when Lacey found out about the boat or never knew about the boat, right? And this is major checkmate, okay? Because if Scott's going to say, oh yeah, I told Lacey about the boat on the day that I bought it, that's very low probability, because nobody knows about the boat. right? So Scott, he's in a checkmate because he can't say that he told his wife on the day that he got the boat on the 9th of December. He can't say that because there would be too much time for Lacey to keep so quiet about the boat, okay, and nobody to know about it. She's not the type of person that wouldn't tell her mom or her stepdad or whatever. So Scott can't say that he told Lacey about the boat on the day. That already looks fishy because why, Scott, why are you not telling your wife? And then it's like, oh, I told my wife, 3 days before Christmas. It's like, it just all starts to sound bad. So that was a perfect area for Al Brocchini to sort of open up some follow-up questions, and obviously do it very, very diplomatically, right? Very diplomatic, very friendly. But Scott cannot say he told Lacey about the boat on the 9th of December because that just, it doesn't sound realistic. But then the more Scott says that he delayed telling Lacey, the more that also seems a little bit fishy as well. Okay, and so there's lots of room for Al Brocchini to just kind of explore the issue of when did Lacey know about the boat, and then tie that parallel later. See what Al Brocchini has to do now is get more information. Okay, Scott, you had plan A and plan B. You had the golf and you had the fishing, right? Golf and fishing, A and B. All right. Now, would you say, Scott, that in the 24 hours before you had to choose between A and B, when you would talk to people and tell them what you were doing, did you tell people more you were going golfing? Or did you tell some people you're going fishing, some people are going golfing, just kind of pin him down. And then Scott would say, oh, I don't remember. I think I told people I was going golfing or whatever. But then you're going to start to say, well, Scott, so we could almost say that maybe people didn't know about the plan B. And so my concern is that maybe in a similar way, people didn't know about your boat. Okay. Now you would save that for a couple interviews down the road, right? But you could at least start getting more information and sort of cornering and pinning Scott and committing himself into contradictions around when he told people about the boat. Okay. And you'll see later on too, that Scott was not the kind of person that would hide anything that made him look good to Amber Fry, right? And he bought the boat right before he went to Amber Fry for a very emotional meeting with Amber Fry in Fresno, right? So Scott was really busy on the 9th of December. And right after he bought the boat, he took a drive all the way down to Fresno and had this very emotional situation with Amber. And it's just kind of interesting that nowhere in the whole time that he spent with Amber did he ever miss the opportunity to make himself look good and say, hey, I just bought a boat. So why wouldn't he tell Amber? Because that's something that makes him look good. He even found ways to make his Range Rover. He told it in a different context, but he didn't lose the opportunity to tell Amber Fry about his Range Rover. So maybe he could say, oh, I bought a motorboat. He could make it sound like a bigger boat, more impressive, but he could say, oh yeah, this morning I was buying a boat or something, because that could make him look good, because it makes him look like somebody who has cool stuff and has extra money. So why would he keep that why would he miss that opportunity? Now, of course, that would be something you would say for way down the road, like maybe 3 weeks later, you could ask him about that. But I'm just saying that right here at this point, when Al Brocchini still hasn't even asked any questions about the timing of when Scott actually told people about the alternative plan to go fishing, or maybe didn't tell anybody. And then parallel to that, maybe didn't tell anybody about the new boat that he got, right? These are very crucial questions. And Al Brocchini just killed all that. He just killed it, because now he's made it clear this is an interrogation. Okay. And now what he's going to do, Al Brocchini's going to put his foot in it again. And if Scott had any doubt about whether this had now turned into an interrogation, now he's going to ask him about how's your marriage. Okay. And I think this just wasn't the time for that, because right now Scott is already kind of wondering, hey, is this an interrogation? And then boom, how's your marriage? It's like Al Brocchini is going for the kill shot too early. Okay. So unfortunately, let's see what happens. This just continues to break down.
Okay, you guys haven't had any problems, marriage problems? Everything's good?
Mm-hmm.
You've been married 4 years.
So unfortunately, this interview is done. Okay. And at this point, I would predict, if I was an attorney involved in this case, I would predict that Scott's no longer going to be cooperative with the police. And anything in the future, Scott's going to be very guarded, or he's already going to have a lawyer at this point. Okay. So all Al Brocchini has done now is he's just making Scott basically think about getting a lawyer. That's all he's done, and they're not going to have any more conversations, anything even resembling an open conversation. There's no more chance. And so if later, let's say the next day, if Al Brocchini has some questions about whether Scott maybe, when he told people about the boat, I mean, we all know the answer. We know that Scott probably told nobody about the boat. That's not the point. You want him to make up some bullshit about how he told people about the boat. You want him to make up reasons. You want him to hang himself a little more so that later you can bring up just like crazy dishonesty around the boat, right? And the other thing too is that we're gonna. Well, I'll save this for later. But there's a part where Scott leaves his alibi voicemail. His just like the Jodi Arias, how she leaves this perfect alibi voicemail where all the information is there, but it clearly suggests that he's already told Lacey about the boat. But you want to save that. You don't want to confront him too fast. You want to maybe let him step into it and say, oh yeah, I told Lacey about the boat on the day before Christmas, whatever. Or I told her 10 days before Christmas, but just let him start making some stuff up, because when you start making stuff up, you start producing more contradictions, and somewhere down the line, if you're patient, you can checkmate him. But Al Brocchini just dumped all that, he dumped all that into San Francisco Bay. So now any possibility of any more information from Scott, Al Brocchini just killed the case. Okay. And so, and to add on top of that, Al Brocchini takes the gun out and shoots himself in the head, because now he's basically going to say, hey, Scott, I need to know if you're going to take a polygraph.
Would you be willing to take a polygraph?
Sure.
So what you're telling me, Scott, is you have no idea where this is. Just to eliminate you as a suspect, you'd be willing to take that. Shut it off. Would you be willing to take a polygraph?
Yeah. And they're accurate, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing that can be used against you, but yeah, I believe they're accurate.
Yeah. No, I'm certainly willing.
I mean, this interview is done. Okay, so at this point, I don't get Al Brocchini. I think he could have been more professional. What he could have done, if he really thinks that Scott is so guilty, what he should have done is he should have gotten maybe together with other policemen and said, look, we're not going to arrest him. I think he's lying. I think he's responsible. We're just going to put surveillance on him, right? And Al Brocchini could have said, look, Scott, I need you to tell me what your plans are for tomorrow, for the next day, because I want to coordinate with you. I want to know when we can talk again. Okay, because I'm gonna study this with my colleagues. I'm gonna talk to some other people. And obviously, I'm going to have some follow-up questions, and you're the one who can help us the most, because you're the last person who saw her alive. So give me some time to go over this information. Give me some time to analyze this, and just let me know where you're going to be tomorrow and the next day, because we're going to need to talk. So Scott would then tell him supposedly what his plans are. And then what I would do is I'd put surveillance on Scott. Okay, so if he does anything that departs from what he said he's going to do, that would be possible grounds. Depending on where he goes, like if he decides he gets nervous, he tries to go to San Diego, that would actually be maybe a sign of consciousness of guilt, and you might get a judge to sign an arrest warrant on that basis. So it's not like Scott's going to disappear. If a good police department, they could put surveillance on the guy. It's like, no need to get nervous. You just need to set up follow-up interviews. Anyway, so what Al Brocchini should have done at this point, okay, I think what's happening is already like Christmas morning. I think this is like the worst day in the world for police to be investigating. It's like Christmas Eve night. It's already early Christmas morning. I think Al Brocchini's probably tired. I don't think he's probably at his best personality right now. He's probably it's just not at his best. It's just late in the evening. There's a lot of emotions. I think this would have been a good time to tell Scott, look, man, I really appreciate you coming in here. Okay, I know this is very stressful, and I know that we have a lot of questions we need to ask, because, we have to be responsible. We got to create a very accurate timeline here. Okay, and there's still some more issues that we need to talk about. But for now, what I'm going to do, Scott, I need to gather this information. I need to kind of analyze some of this stuff. I also need to talk to some other people. I need to talk to some other investigators. And obviously, we're going to interview some other people, and we want to get back to you. Okay, that's what I would have done. And you can see where Al Brocchini, instead of having that attitude of, okay, we're just going to kind of sit on this, we're going to kind of analyze it, he actually makes a huge mistake on top of all the other mistakes, okay, where he actually misunderstands how the voicemail, where Scott sends the voicemail to Lacey, his alibi voicemail from Berkeley Marina, and he actually gets confused because during the interview at 12:17 a.m., okay, that voicemail is saved, right? And he gets that confused with how Scott said he sent the voicemail around 2 p.m., which is actually accurate, okay? And so he starts challenging Scott on this, and it's very clear that Al Brocchini is not gathering his information and he's not really being professional. Okay, so this really sucks. I mean, this is on top of everything else. I mean, he's already screwed this interview. There's going to be no future interrogation of Scott. Okay, but let's just take a look at this where Al Brocchini drops the ball.
I have a couple concerns. One is the cell phone call that you made. If you listen to it, that call was made at 12:17. The first one you made from Berkeley.
Yeah.
You
I
said,
think it's from the vote.
no, you said 2:17, but the timestamp on the call says 12:17.
So Al Brocchini is clearly just too desperate to go for the kill shot, and he's not doing the professional thing of just saying, "Okay, Scott, we're gonna sit on this. I'm gonna analyze this. I'm gonna talk to my colleagues. I'm gonna talk to some more witnesses, and we'll talk tomorrow." And I really look forward to seeing you, and I really look forward to further cooperation with us. Hopefully, we can really do a good job of setting up the timeline here, and I'll really appreciate that. So. He lost that opportunity. And the most important opportunity that Al Brocchini lost that night was the opportunity to sleep on things, just to sleep on things, okay? Because I think in the morning, had Al Brocchini just gotten rested, come back to the office, maybe talk to a few other detectives, maybe talk to some other witnesses, I think it could have been very clear to him just in the next morning that Scott had not told anybody about the boat or about his plan to go fishing, okay? I think Scott had told everybody about the golfing, just about the golfing, and that the whole idea of fishing, that was kept to himself. Okay. And I think, I don't think anybody knew about the boat. Okay. And those are two huge, huge issues. All right. And then finally, even I have trouble fully explaining how important the boat is. The boat is so important. Okay. Because the question is, when did Scott tell anybody about the boat? Okay. If it looks like Scott told nobody about the boat, that looks bad, and that starts to connect maybe even the cheating behavior, because we'll see later that the boat is actually the timing of the boat is timed right where Scott is having a major emotional crisis with his affair with Amber Fry. Okay. And so if on top of that, if you can prove, or if Scott even admits that he didn't even tell Lacey about the boat until maybe the very last minute, okay, that's going to look terrible for Scott. Okay. And I think that could have checkmated him. All right. So if I were investigating this case, I think the first thing I would have done is I would have gotten a good night's sleep. Okay. And then I would have made a checklist of things to do the next day. Okay. The first thing I would do, even before closing this interview, I would have Scott tell me what your plans are for the next 3 days. Okay. I need to know exactly what your plans are. And I need you to call me if you change those plans. Okay. Because this is a very important, crucial, we're still in the first few days where Lacey may still be alive. You just grease them up, she may still be alive. And so we need to really be solid on our timeline and our information. So I'm going to do some other investigating. I'm going to talk to some other people. I'm going to analyze the evidence we have so far. But I need to know when I can follow up with you, and I need you to tell me what you're going to be doing the next 3 days. Okay. And then I'd put surveillance on him, right? And then I would get a good night's sleep. Okay. And the next day I would talk to other witnesses, and I would start to ask them about how many people heard about fishing. Okay. Did he tell anybody that he was maybe going fishing? Okay. Maybe. That's an important thing. And then I'm going to start asking everybody, do you know about Scott's recent purchase of a small boat? And just ask people, just figure out if nobody has any idea, that's super important. Okay. And then I would listen very carefully to his supposed alibi voicemail, because there's a lot of information here. So let's listen to it.
Hey, beautiful. I just left a message at home. 2:15. I live in Berkeley. I won't be able to get to Villa Farms to get that basket for Papa. I was hoping you would get this message and go on out there. I'll see you in a bit, sweetie. Love you. Bye.
So this voicemail is super important, because more than likely what's going to happen is Al Brocchini is going to talk to some other witnesses, talk to a lot of people, and nobody's going to know anything about the boat. Nobody's going to know anything about the boat, right? But in this voicemail, he's implying that Lacey knows about the boat, because he says, I'm leaving Berkeley. Okay. If Lacey doesn't know about the boat and he says, I'm leaving Berkeley, she's going to be, what the hell? Like Berkeley, so what this is suggesting in the voicemail that Lacey knows he's going to Berkeley, knows he's going fishing. She's the only one who knows that he had the plan B of going fishing. Nobody else knows that, right? And then it also suggests that she knows about the boat. So Scott, later on, you're not gonna confront him with the voicemail. You're just gonna ask him, okay, so Scott, okay, So we know you got the boat on December 9th. Okay. So let us know. I mean, I'm assuming you didn't tell Lacey right away, but did you? I mean, did you tell Lacey right away? Or if not, how many days passed before you told Lacey, and why? Why, was it you wanted to surprise her or whatever, And so Scott's going to make up some bullshit, but he has to say that he told her because the voicemail implies that he told her. The only question is, where's he going to put the date? If he puts the date too close to December 9th, okay, then the question is, how is it that nobody knew about this boat? Because Lacey is a talker. Lacey would never not say to her mother, about the boat. Even if it was like 2 days before she went missing, Lacey would almost certainly have told her mom that Scott bought a boat, because that's just a huge piece of news. And she might have even have been kind of upset about it, to be quite honest, because here she is pregnant and they're trying to they have bad finances. Their financial situation is not that good, and they've got a new baby on the way. And Scott has this totally selfish purchase of a boat that's going to be of no use to Lacey, because we know that she gets seasick and she doesn't even like fishing, right? So the only person who's going to enjoy this boat is Scott himself, but they have a new kid on the way and they got financial problems. So more than likely, Lacey's not going to be thrilled about this boat, really. Okay. So there's nothing Scott can say to make this sound good. In other words, if he says he told Lacey on the December 9th, that's totally unrealistic, because so early she would have told people, okay. But then if he says, oh, I waited until, let's say, Christmas Eve to tell her, and I only told her, and then it's like, okay, Scott, but why delay so much? I wanted to surprise her. It's like, wait a minute. If you really do some investigating, Lacey wouldn't be amused by that surprise. It wouldn't be a pleasant surprise. Okay, so you would have no motive to delay like that. Or to claim that it's a surprise, because she probably wouldn't be happy about the boat. So there's nothing that Scott can say to make that sound favorable, to make that sound favorable to his case. And also too, if he says, well, I waited until the 24th of December, he might even have to say, well, I was afraid to tell her. And if he says that, he's in another trouble, so there's almost nothing he can do, but he's going to have to say something. Okay. And so as he starts to make up stuff, he can't say that he never told her, right? So the question is the timing, and every timing he has for telling Lacey, that's going to create another problem. Then there's the question of the fishing license. Okay, so if Al BROCCHINI just stays calm and just gathers his information, doesn't turn this into an interrogation, just keeps having friendly conversations with Scott, at some point he's gonna say, okay, Scott, so you got your fishing license. If you could just share that with us, just so we can have complete documentation. So you got your fishing license. It's like, oh, okay, I see you got the fishing license on the 20th. So that was just a few days before, and you got the fishing license for the 2 days. So I would tell Scott, so that's kind of when you had the A and the B, right? That's when you were thinking, oh, it'll either be golf or fishing. So you bought yourself the option to go fishing with the fishing license, right? You bought yourself the option, right? And Scott will say, yeah, that was what it was. I bought the fishing license to give myself the option. So then my question would be, okay, Scott, so you have the option of going fishing, which means maybe 50% chance you're going to lose that money, because it's only a 2-day license, Scott, right? Just a 2-day license. So you're gambling on that, right? You might as well just thrown that money away, because you're paying like $12 for a 50% chance of using it on those 2 days, right? So if you're so cavalier with your money, where you're willing to take that risk, why not just spend the $15 more or the $18 more and get yourself a 1-year license, right? So you don't have to be losing money, right? And he won't have a good explanation for that, right? But you want to save that for down the road, right? So basically, if he had just kept Scott on a more friendly terms, where it wasn't so clear he was being interrogated, at some point Scott's going to fall into major checkmate traps. And I think that would have set up a much better case for him not to risk having a hung jury at the guilt phase of his actual trial, because he came very close to getting a hung jury, And so let's think about that some more. I don't want to pass over that too quickly. If he bought the fishing license, let's say that again, right? He buys the fishing license knowing that it's just an option, right? That implies that he's not for sure going to not be throwing away his money, right? So why wouldn't he just spend $18 more to get the 1-year license? You see, so now Scott's going to have some stupid answer for that, but whatever he says is going to start to put him more in trouble. And I think it's going to set up a stronger case. And this could also be used to sort of confront Scott in a future interview as to when he claims he told Lacey about his fishing plan or even his boat. Okay, because let's say Scott starts saying, well, I think I told Lacey like right around like the day before Christmas Eve. He's not going to say he told her on Christmas Eve. I don't think so. He'll tell her, I think I told her the day before. Not very realistic. Um, but then you show him the fishing license of the 20th and you say, so Scott, this is where you had the plan A and the plan B. This is where you bought your option to go fishing, right? So you got your option to go fishing on the 20th. Is this maybe when you told Lacey that you were going to maybe go fishing? And he might even fall for it and say, yeah, this is when I told Lacey I might go fishing. And so I'd say, okay, so on the 20th, then this might be the day when you actually told Lacey about the boat. And he'll be like, oh, yeah, I told her on the 20th, but that would be perfect. Because that would give Lacey 4 days or three or 4 days that she didn't tell her mom or any friends about the boat. You see, so Scott has to be real careful here, because then his other option is to tell the police, well, okay, I bought the fishing license, but I did not tell Lacey. Okay, that makes him look deceptive, right? Or I bought the fishing license, didn't tell Lacey, and I also didn't tell her about the boat on that day. So that makes him look like he's hiding stuff. So there's nothing he can say. So whatever he says is going to make his case go down. And as with our daily lives, the same is true with Al Brocchini. When we commit errors, when we commit big errors in life, there's always ramifications, multiple ramifications. Okay, so in this case, Al Brocchini gets too aggressive. He ratchets up the interrogation mode. He kills the friend zone. He's not trying to get along with Scott anymore. He's taken off the mask, and it's very clear he's just trying to interrogate Scott. And so he's lost the opportunity to close the timeline as to when Scott actually left the house and supposedly left Lacey alone. Okay. Now let's remember, this is for issue 3. If you look down at my little issues, number 3 is alternative theories. Okay. The only reason that alternative seems to be plausible now is because a lot of us believe that Scott had a window between say 9:30 in the morning and let's say 10:30 in the morning, that maybe Lacey could have been abducted by somebody else. Okay, so he gives himself what appears to be a whole hour before Karen Service brings the dog back at, he says, 10:30, right? Now, we already know from examining Karen Service's activities, she went to purchase something at a store. And so just by analyzing the actual timeline of when she was buying stuff at the store, they've estimated that she actually wasn't back at 10:30, but probably more like 10:18, like around, say 10:20, 10, whatever, 10:20. So we were already chopping 10 minutes off. Okay. But then on the other side, when did Scott leave the house? Now he claims 9:30 and even says, we know this. He said this in interviews. Well, that's what he wants us to think. Okay. But see, Scott's already admitted that he saw the meringue on Martha Stewart. And if Al Brocchini had calmed down and if he had carefully analyzed the transcripts from Martha Stewart, it would have been proven that Scott couldn't have left the house any earlier than 9:48. That's a whole 18 minutes, almost 20 minutes. And of course, in realism, it's not like as soon as he heard meringue, he just shot out the door and left. No, he would have needed time to get his market umbrellas organized and set up his truck and whatever. So we can definitely imagine that had Al Brocchini done a better job of doing his homework, had he slept that night and just kind of rested himself, gathered his wits the next day and just started analyzing all this information. And then if he had the opportunity to further to further talk to Scott, in the following 2 or 3 days, okay, he could have pressed a little bit Scott's detail about having seen the meringue on Martha Stewart. Now we know that meringue was mentioned at 9:48. Okay, but then you have to imagine you could get Scott honestly and reasonably to admit that after the meringue, he could just recall, and you could ask him carefully, and he could say, yeah, I think maybe 3 or 4 more minutes after the meringue, and then yeah, I put on my jacket and I went to the bathroom, and you can just start adding the minutes, and then it gets closer to 10 o'clock, not 9:30, right? And then you see, had Al Brocchini done a better job of getting him to really cough up more information, you see, then we wouldn't have all the problem with the cell phone tower location data. Okay, now I work in criminal defense, and I know that we've had a lot of cases where a lot of times the prosecution has like 80% of their cases locating the defendant using cell tower location, right? And you can definitely challenge cell tower data, right? Because occasionally what'll happen with the phone is it'll communicate with a more distant tower. It'll happen just for a brief moment, and you can analyze that. But here, if Al Brocchini had done a much better job of really analyzing the Martha Stewart transcript and also getting Scott to admit that he was probably at home maybe another 4 or 5 minutes, maybe put on his jacket, maybe went to the bathroom, then you could definitely corroborate, okay, what the cell phone location, the tower location data, which indicated he was near home like as late as 10:08. Okay, so then you really start closing in the time. But you see, if we're just going to depend on the cell tower location data, that can be criticized, that can be attacked. You need to have corroboration. And so if Al Brocchini had done a better job of holding on to the conversation a few more days, doing better homework, a better analysis of the Martha Stewart transcript, you could have really closed Scott in to where, he would claim he left the house at 9:30, but really he would probably have left the house more like 10:05 or 10:06, something like that. And then Karen Service, we know that she came back like around 10:18. So now there's just very little time. And so combined with the other information, like if we had stronger information that Scott had lied about, let's say when he told Lacey about the boat, or maybe he said something not very credible, like claims to have told Lacey about the boat maybe weeks ahead or days ahead, but then Lacey didn't mention anything about the boat to her parents or anything. You see, then I think the case would have been just that much stronger, that you would be in a situation where I don't think you would have even a risk of a hung jury. You see, and I think that could have changed the whole dynamics of how the prosecution negotiated with the defense, okay? And you maybe could have gotten Scott to actually agree to a plea bargain, of course, leaving the death penalty off the table. And then finally, okay, so to sort of conclude this part, this is just like my part one, okay, but just to conclude this part, okay, in order to tie all of the logistics about how Lacey disappeared and the boat and all of what Scott was doing on the 24th, to tie that to his affair with Amber Frey, okay, because there is a connection, okay? If Al Brocchini first had better information from Scott, and it doesn't really matter whether Scott told the truth or lied about the boat, like he could mix in truth and lies, just to get him talking, because when he tells lies, eventually those are going to be, you'll find contradictions in those lies. So it's good for people to tell lies, right? But if he just got Scott to talk more about the boat, maybe to make up stuff to say, oh yeah, and then I told Lacey when I first bought the boat, blah, blah, blah. Although I think it's more likely that Scott probably would have tried to tell cops that he probably did not tell Lacey right when he bought the boat, right? And I think the reason why he would say that to the cops is because then it would just become unbelievable that Lacey wouldn't have told a friend or a family member or her parents, right? So probably Scott is sort of trapped where he has to kind of claim that he told her about the boat, like at least like on the 20th or the 21st, because it would also be suspicious if he told her about it on the 24th, because then he's going to have to claim it was a surprise. And I don't think the boat would be a very nice surprise for Lacey. But anyway, bottom line is that if he got more information from Scott, right, he could then start tying everything to the affair with Amber, because this is the thing, okay? If Al Brocchini had maintained rapport with Scott and kept Scott on a friendly basis, right? And also, if they didn't put Amber Frey in the television news, right? If they just kept Amber Frey in their pocket, right, as a secret, right? They would already know from Amber Frey that on the exact day that Scott bought the boat, right, he was in this major emotional crisis with Amber Frey, right? So then as they start to close the conversations and as they finally start to confront Scott, like when they finally get to the point of interrogating him, right, they could tell him, okay, Scott, well, here's the thing. Okay, on the day that you bought this boat, you were already going through 3 days. You had already for 3 days been going through a crisis with your new girlfriend. And I mean a crisis, right? Because she found out that you were married, and then you had to make up a bunch of crap. And then you had to go over to her house and just have this whole crisis, right? And so your brain is all occupied with this crisis. And somehow during those 3 days of crisis, you at the same time were all occupied with buying a boat. Okay, now, I understand schizophrenia, right? People can have two brains, but your brain is way divided, right? So what's more likely, Scott, is that your brain is occupied with this big crisis with your girlfriend, okay? And I don't think you had a lot of room in your head to have all these parallel simultaneous thoughts of just recreation on a boat, right? So we have to assume, Scott, and this is where you actually confront him. We have to assume that you were really occupied with trying to save face with your girlfriend, and that you were in a emotional crisis, right? So we have to assume that you purchasing the boat was connected to Amber. Now, can you tell us another explanation, Scott, so that we don't have to think that? And then Scott would really be in a pickle, because he would have to say, oh yeah, I was having this crisis with Amber, but at the same time, I didn't really take it seriously. And the other part of me was completely divided. And the other part of me was just thinking about recreation. And then we'd say, yeah, and at the same time, you weren't telling your wife about it. So is that weird? Like, your wife doesn't have to know about your recreation. Like, you're like split into three people right now, Scott. So I think he would have a lot of trouble explaining that. Okay. Just because of the timing. And, we already know that the purchase of the boat was timed with his crisis with Amber. We know that, but you could maybe tighten it a little more if you had a little more information from Scott about like what he did or did not tell Lacey about the boat, right? It would just make it easier to sort of eventually confront him. And also, if Al Brocchini wasn't so premature about confronting Scott, right? If Al Brocchini didn't turn on the interrogation so early, they could have kept these conversations going long enough that they would have a rapport and a trust where they could finally confront Scott when they had more information. Okay. And I think that would help build a better record. And I think it would help convince a jury that whatever was happening with Amber and the crisis, the boat was not really disconnected from that. Okay. And then finally, the killer is, why didn't you tell Amber about the boat? You were telling Amber about everything that made you look good. You were even making up stuff, any chance you had to make yourself look good to Amber. Why wouldn't it help you to let her know, oh, this morning I was buying a boat? That would make you look good. It sort of makes it look like he's hiding the boat, right? So these are just little things, they seem like little things, but when you're interrogating somebody, or when you're, when you're interviewing somebody, it's the little things that matter. And I think it's always a good policy to sort of keep the conversations going in a very friendly way, and maybe have 2 or 3 or 4 days of conversation, right? So, that's my analysis of the Al Brocchini interview, and I think it really did make a difference. I think the only reason why the Petersons, why they think they have a possible defense right now, is because I think in the beginning, I think the police investigators, I think they could have done a much better job in the beginning of getting more information out of Scott, and now we see the results, right? We all know what happened, but I think in the public there still remains the idea of maybe more doubt than I think there really is in this case. So that's my analysis of the Brocchini interview, and appreciate your patience, and thanks for watching.